And now we cross over to our Usuyang for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Morgan. It is indeed time for global insight. As the war in Ukraine continues, Russian missiles and rockets struck Ukraine's second-largest city, killing at least 10 people and injuring 35 more. The impact of war has been devastating enough already. Russian forces have been bombarding residential areas. The number of people fleeing Ukraine has surged to more than 500,000, and at least 102 civilians have been killed since Moscow's troops entered the country, according to the United Nations. Today we discuss the ongoing war in its sixth day. And for this, we connect with Kari, political scientist and political communications strategist, and Joseph Bosco, former China country director for the Secretary of Defense and opinion contributor to The Hill. Thank you both for joining us today. And well, let's start with you, Kari, there in Frankfurt. Now, throughout this six-day war now, the resilience of the Ukrainian people, it's been remarkable to watch. And they've been living with a Russian-backed assault lingering on their doorsteps for years and years, of course, since 2014, as you said previously. But now any semblance of normalcy seems to be gone with this war. And, well, what is the current reality now for Ukrainians in the country? Sorry, we cannot hear you.
Forgive me for that. I think it's important that you mentioned that the conflict has been going on and there's been tension since 2014. Ukrainians are accustomed to a certain amount of pressure from Russia for many years. And the difference now is that it is everyone's worst nightmare coming true. There was much speculation in December, January, even going back to the spring of 2021, where the troops started amassing on Ukraine's border, about what was actually going to happen. And until the bombs actually started dropping, no one thought that the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin would take it this far. Now, of course, the resilience of Ukrainians is something very, very admirable, but at what cost for their future and for Europe? And I think it's important to note that this is going to affect Ukrainian society for years to come.
And now, Mr. Bosco, well, there's been quite a lot of talk about, well, there's a lot of quoting Clausewitz and the strategy when it comes to war and how wars always are, well, wars tend to be a continuation of policy, really bringing many people to wonder what Mr. Putin's objectives really are for this war with Ukraine. So what do you think it really is? What do you think his intentions are? And is he in for a long war? I mean, how far is he going to go to carry this war into its conclusion?
Is that question for me, Soo-young?
Yes, that's for you.
Yeah, I think Putin's objectives are much longer term and farther in scope than people have been willing to acknowledge. He once said that the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster in the 20th century. And he intends to reconstitute the Soviet Union under perhaps a different name. But he's after not just Ukraine, but Georgia, which he invaded in 2005, and the adjoining country, the Baltics, and other countries that were once part of the Soviet Union. He wants them back. He believes that he has a right on behalf of the old Soviet Union or on behalf of modern Russia to put them all back together under Moscow's rule. This is a very, very precarious situation, and I think the West must understand the incredible ambitions that this man has.
And Joe, what do you think it's going to really take Ukraine? What's it going to take for Ukraine to win? I mean, is it conventional defences and the resistance that even the ordinary Ukrainians are putting off? Is that going to be enough for Putin to actually surrender?
Well, I think the definition of winning is important to discuss. For Ukraine to win, they simply have to not lose. That is, they have to not surrender to Moscow or to Putin, and keep the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of of Ukraine intact. They don't have to, obviously, they have no intention of invading Russia. And as far as Putin surrendering, I don't think that will ever happen in those terms. I think the West must make the cost of his invasion so onerous that he will decide to seek some kind of face-saving way out. I do want to mention that at the Nuremberg Tribunal for the Nazis back in the 1940s, they decided that there were three categories of crime, international crimes. One was a war of aggression, an unprovoked attack. The other is the crimes against humanity. And the third was crimes against civilians in the war itself. Putin has violated all three of those criteria. So in effect, Putin is a war criminal. And I hope the international community will begin investigating and taking the necessary procedural steps to bring him before a tribunal for his crimes.
And Kari, Russian forces seized two small cities in southeastern Ukraine and the area around a nuclear power plant. What does that mean for the people there or other Russia-controlled areas?
Well, first off, it means that they're not doing as well as they thought they'd do. Two small cities on day 6 of this conflict. There has been immense loss of life, and it's a terrible situation. But there is enough indication that the Kremlin miscalculated its ability to take over some of its key strategic goals. The city of Sumy, which is a smaller city in northeastern Ukraine, is still fighting back, although it's been encircled. There's heavy fighting in Kharkiv and heavy bombing. The problem with the resilience and the resistance of the Ukrainians is that Vladimir Putin keeps moving then on to harder measures. There's been reports that he's been using something called vacuum bombing. Of course, he's using missiles. There's been reports of carpet bombing. So as much success, or as Joseph said, winning is actually not losing for the Ukrainians. And as much as they're not losing, then it seems that the attacks are leveled up and leveled up. So to be very direct, what this means for the people living there now in areas where there are Russian troops is life is very, very difficult. And it is hard to see who really is a member of the military and who is a civilian in some situations, because the Ukrainians are working so closely together to defend their cities.
And Joe, now President Vladimir Putin, he caused a lot of concern a few days ago when he ordered his nuclear forces to be put on high alert during these tensions with the West. Do you think that the Russian president is willing to go to that level and use the nuclear weapons? How do you see the risk of this actually escalating into a nuclear war?
Well, it's not a new question, considering that for 50 years we had the Cold War, and the Soviet Union and the United States were at loggerheads. They both had nuclear weapons and missiles pointing at each other. So it's not a new question for Putin. The question is he a new type of Russian leader who will actually take such a drastic step as to use nuclear weapons? I think not, but I think he believes that threatening to do so gives him additional leverage over the West. And again, he's not the first one to use that tactic either. Xi Jinping of China has a couple of times mentioned the possibility of nuclear war if he doesn't get his way on Taiwan and the South China Sea. But Putin is certainly pressing things to the limit, and I think the cost must be increased on his activities so that he decides that they're not worth the candle.
And Kari, now there's a lot of concern in the international community that the humanitarian crisis is that it could turn out to be disastrous. And well, the armed violence is already, of course, causing human suffering, civilian casualties, damage to infrastructure, as we saw in large-scale displacement, with 500,000 Ukrainians already having fled the country. What kind of assistance is needed for Ukrainians both inside and outside the country right now?
Well, let's talk about what's going on outside the country right now. Ukraine's neighbors, Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Moldova, Hungary, they are supporting with formal government-supported and private initiatives people as soon as they get across the border. Now, there are problems on the Ukrainian side simply because of the amount of people that you mentioned which are coming over. And there are priorities. Women and children are being led over first. Men between the ages of 18 and 60 are not, Ukrainian men are not being allowed to leave the country so they can defend the country. And once someone actually makes it outside of the country, there is a support system that is intact now. Poland and Germany have offered Ukrainian refugees free train tickets. These are important gestures. But the people inside are faced with the challenges and what needs to be done to make their lives easier. Of course, the obvious answer is the Kremlin needs to stop bombing Ukraine, but they are going to be in need of food, water, temporary shelter. They're going to be in need of psychological services. And there's basic things like generators, internet service. And at some point, the infrastructure that has been destroyed is going to need to be replaced at a very high cost. And it's important that plans start being made right away so Ukraine can bounce back once this conflict ends.
And Joe, top aides to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin held talks that lasted almost 5 hours, apparently. It seems that they discussed a possible ceasefire, although both sides appear to show different sort of reactions or reactions after their talks. What do you think Russia is asking of Ukraine, and do you think there still could be a diplomatic way out?
Well, I think what Russia is asking for is complete surrender. Just as they demanded that from NATO, they wanted a guarantee that we would never allow Ukraine or Georgia or any other country to join NATO. So they're seeking, all of the objectives that Putin has laid out in the past. I think, as I said before, that the costs to Putin must be increased dramatically. And I think one important factor here is, and our other guest may know the answer to this, is what kind of information are the Russian people receiving about what is going on? Do they know about the casualties among their own forces? I think the West needs to get that information into the Russian people. They're already protesting. They don't want this war. And between that public protest and the oligarchs who are unhappy with the sanctions, I think there are enough forces in Russia that are building, and we ought to support them, to get rid of Putin once and for all, and to have the international community bring him before a war crimes tribunal.
And Kari, well, as the Ukrainian Prime Minister said, the Russian leadership does not understand that this is, that Ukraine is, that the people of Ukraine are also fighting alongside the armed forces of Ukraine. And well, then how should the global community really show their support by standing with them, and how should they express their support for the Ukrainian people's resistance?
This ties into what Joseph mentioned a moment ago about how much the Russian citizens really know about what's happening in Ukraine. And this ties in because social media and what not only the Ukrainian citizens can do, but the rest of us can do around the world by constantly amplifying the message, the truth coming out of Ukraine, by showing the pictures about what is happening. The bombing of the main square in Kharkiv, there was no reason for that. And there have been reports on social media throughout Ukraine being shared of prisoners of war saying that Russian prisoners of war being captured saying, I didn't know that I wasn't on a maneuver, or my commander told me that I would be welcomed as a liberator, and they're shocked that they're not being welcomed into Ukraine. So that's one of the first things. And this ties into the whole aspect of hybrid war and how Russia has been conducting it against Ukraine since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, but the Ukrainian people have become savvy to this and have learned how to fight back.
I don't hear anything. I don't know whether I've entirely lost my connection.
Right, so a bit of confusion there, but yes, please continue,
That's
Kari.
okay. And that's just the point I wanted to make. The other three things that need to be mentioned that's unprecedented right now is economically, the global community has very much jumped in with sanctions and shown solidarity at a level that hasn't been seen. And for the first time, the European Union is actually going to be financing weapons that they'll deliver to another country. The only problem is, and this needs to be mentioned, and although Ukraine is not a member of NATO, closing the airspace over Ukraine would save Ukrainian lives right now.
And well, this is where we'll have to leave it today as we're out of time. That was Kari ODERMANN, political scientist and political communications strategist, and Joseph Bosco, former China country director for the Secretary of Defense in the US and also opinion contributor to The Hill. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Nice to be with you.